episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show with another fascinating guest who is helping to create a better tomorrow for all of us. We are honored today to be joined by Dr. Derek Yach, who has been a global health expert and anti-smoking advocate for more than the last 30 years and is founder, president, and board member of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, and is also a passionate advocate for health promotion and disease prevention of all types. Dr. Yach is former World Health Organization cabinet director and executive director for noncommunicable diseases and mental health, where he was deeply involved with the development of the World's Treaty on Tobacco Control, also known as the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. He's also the former chief health officer of the Vitality Group, executive director of the Vitality Institute, senior vice president of global health and agricultural policy at Pepsi, director of global health at the Rockefeller Foundation, and a professor of global health at Yale University. Dr. Yach has authored or co-authored more than 250 peer-reviewed articles on global health and has served on several advisory boards, including the World Economic Forum, Cornerstone Capital, and the Wellcome Trust. Dr. Yach is a dual citizen of both the United States and South Africa. He has an honorary doctorate from Georgetown University, his medical degree from University of Cape Town, with specialty in epidemiology at the University of Stellenbosch, and a master's in public health from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And in addition to his numerous appointments at advisory boards and awards, he is also an accomplished long-distance swimmer, and we'll get into that a little later. And as a quick background, the Foundation for Smoke-Free World is an independent nonprofit organization that funds research, promotes innovation, supports collaborative initiatives committed to reducing deaths and diseases caused by smoking, and ultimately has a major goal of ending smoking in this generation. Foundation's work focuses on three core areas that we'll get into, including health science and technology, agriculture and livelihoods, and industrial transformation. And as a disclosure, the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World has received this initial funding of $1 billion, $80 million a year for 12 years from the Philip Morris Company, but Philip Morris cannot engage in any activities related to and has no involvement in the say of their work. Dr. Derek Yach, thank you for taking the time again out of your schedule to come on the show.
Hi, nice to speak to you again, Ira.
It's good seeing you. It's great seeing you again. Derek, I'd like to start off, as we did in our last conversation, just by once again handing you the floor for a little bit, just if you could take some time to introduce yourself, a little bit of your background, where you grew up, how you got interested in public health and medicine, and a little bit of your journey to this fascinating organization. I think it'd be a great way to start off.
Thanks, Ira. Well, as you say, I'm from South Africa, and I grew up during the height of the apartheid years. And it was very clear to us both at school and when I went into medical school that some of the biggest challenges related to how you close social class inequalities and race-based inequalities in a country that for decades had actively practiced a policy of separating blacks and whites and providing differential services, which meant poor quality services to black South Africans. That not only motivated me to go into medicine, but more importantly, to see that the biggest impact I felt I could make was not in clinical medicine, but was as an epidemiologist and somebody who was involved in documenting the extent of inequalities by race and class and looking at the underlying causes of death and disease and bringing those to the fore in a policy forum. And for many years, that was the work we did in South Africa. It was both in the pre-apartheid and in the immediate post-apartheid period. And I think to some extent, the data and the material and the information that we brought to light probably helped play a role in what became the post-apartheid era and the start of the Mandela government. A lot of the work then focused understandably on infectious diseases. Tuberculosis was common. HIV/AIDS was just starting to appear, and we were starting to do the first research on it. But chronic diseases were common, cardiovascular disease, many cancers. And we knew and predicted, sadly, that smoking and other chronic disease-related risk factors would rise as urbanization was happening. And in fact, that happened. About a year after President Mandela assumed the office, I was recruited by the World Health Organization as the first South African to rejoin after South Africa had been out of the organization during apartheid. And the main work I did a few years later was under Gro Harlem Brundtland, the Director General, finding a new way to address tobacco control. And we used, for the first time, and the only time, the treaty-making right of the World Health Organization to develop the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. That took 5 years of a lot of negotiations and discussions, digging into the science, the economics, understanding what would work and what wouldn't. The long of the short of it was, at the end of the 5 years, a treaty was accepted that is now signed on to by 182 countries around the world. It includes all the elements of tobacco control, from taxes to advertising bans and so on. And in the definition of tobacco control, the term that later became important in my work, harm reduction, was incorporated right from the beginning. Shortly after leaving WHO, I then went and had a sojourn through a number of interesting places. I was a professor at Yale, as you said. I won't go into it. But I think the one or two important ones that led me to where I am now, one was being recruited by Indra Nooyi as her first recruit when she became the CEO of PepsiCo. Mm-hmm. And that was the first time my colleagues accused me of having moved to the dark side. Having been involved in trying to develop food and nutrition policy in WHO, they didn't like the fact that I was now going into the belly of the beast, where my job was to try and provide intellectual scientific research input to guide the development of a portfolio to lower salt, sugar, fat, trans fats, and so on. I thought it was an extraordinary opportunity to bridge what had been a huge schism between private and public science and research. And I would say what I learned was that the quality of science and research inside the private sector is extremely high, often well beyond that which people understand in the public sector. Something that I landed up understanding when I started looking at tobacco and e-cigarette related research as well. After 5 years, I left and went to another private company based out of South Africa, but working globally, which tries to incentivize healthy behavior. And the basic philosophy was, we insure people, but we don't try and improve the quality of their life or their health. We call it life insurance, but it's actually death insurance, because you pay up and then you pay your money every year, and then you're dead and somebody gets the money. What they were trying to do was to say, let's turn it into true life insurance. Let's understand your risks. Let's incentivize you to reduce them as much as you can, and we will lower your premiums. You will live longer, we will be more profitable, and everybody wins. And that was the basis of what's now called shared value insurance. In the process of doing that, it became very clear to me that we were making good progress on getting people to increase physical activity, to getting them to be screened, to use vaccines, a whole lot of stuff. But the one area where we were really failing was on smoking cessation, particularly in adults. And so I started looking at what was on the cusp of innovation. And at that time, e-cigarettes was just starting to take off. And the long of the short of it was I wrote a review which surprised me when I dug into the literature to show that maybe this was the technology disruption we'd always hoped would come to a dirty old industry, the tobacco industry, and allow them to separate the stuff that kills you, which is all the tar and the stuff that comes out of combustion, as opposed to the stuff that doesn't kill you, but keeps you using it, nicotine. And certainly that is what an e-cigarette does. That's what snus does. That's what the new heated tobacco products do. And that brought me into conversation with the CEO of Philip Morris International. And over a course of time, I got to see the level of sophistication of the research they were doing, where there were 400 senior researchers, mostly coming out of the pharmaceutical industry, all driven by this intent desire to lower the risk, to remove the risk, to separate the stuff that kills and what doesn't. We saw the start of the rollout in Japan and Korea, where now, all these years later, almost 50% of Philip Morris's sales in those parts of the world are reduced risk products, which means people have moved off combustibles. And in the discussions, it became clear that there was an interest on their side and on mine to form a foundation that would fill the huge research gaps in how we could accelerate adult cessation and harm reduction, and at the same time meet the needs of farmers who would be hopefully from the one perspective, put out of work because there would be a lower demand, but from their perspective, in a terrible, dire livelihood crisis. And that's how we eventually put the foundation together. And as you said, it's been done in accordance with US IRS rules to ensure our independence and that there can be no self-dealing.
Thank you for that introduction. Appreciate that. The foundation focuses on looking at a variety of indices, and one of the primary ones that you work with, you call the Tobacco Transformation Index. You take the 15 largest tobacco companies in the world, which represent something like 90% of all the cigarettes, and you rate them based on how decent they're doing it, as you were saying, sort of getting rid of combustion. And in the recent one in 2020, especially the Swedish match at the top, they got rid of their combustible cigarettes back in 1999 or something. Everybody else is sort of underneath Swedish match. Take us on a little trip, please, through what things are looking like, what they look like in 2020, but how things are shaping up in the index as we go into this new year.
Yeah, thanks, Ira. I mean, the overall philosophy of the index was to say that if we stimulate and make visible what different companies are doing, we suspect there would be even greater competition for them to reduce the risk of the entire portfolio. And more importantly, that it would make it visible to investors who actually are very interested in many of the stock for the multinationals, and hopefully for the laggards, particularly the state monopolies. So we believe that the more the data is put out in the public domain and the data that matters, the more we'd have a sensible public debate about how you can accelerate this transition. As you say, we were looking at factors that we believed are material to real change. So it's just to give you a sense of some of the things we're interested in is, there was a belief from the panel that was advising us and the group involved that if a company is investing its CapEx, its capital expenditure, in new plant and machinery for reduced risk products and closing down old plant that were making combustibles, that's probably a good thing. That means there's serious change. If they were increasing their research and development and actually putting out patents in the field around innovations to actually reduce risk, improve inhalation qualities, reduce some of these safety concerns, that would be a good thing. Summed together, we thought the single composite measure that tells whether a company is really changing is to ask the question, what percentage of total sales are now coming from reduced risk as opposed to combustible or the traditional portfolio? And that's where, with some variations on sales or revenue, that Swedish match came out on top. As you said, they have mainly a smokeless category. They're known for snus and some of the new nicotine pouch categories. But they do have a few cigars still lurking out there, so they're not completely out of the combustible market. At 44% of sales being from reduced risk. Philip Morris, when we wrote the report, was second at about 19%. Today, they're closer to 23, 24%. And almost all of the others were dramatically lower. You had a category of British American tobacco, Korean, and a few others in the 5% range. And then you had a large group of companies where there was zero activity on harm reduction. And we weren't only looking at what they were doing in the market, but we were looking at earlier indicators of whether they had made a public commitment to get onto the reduced risk journey. And at the time, there were very few who'd made that explicit commitment. In fact, since the index, a few others have come on board and been more explicit, BAT, Altria, and so on. In the laggard camp, people are often surprising to think that the really big tobacco company in the world is not Philip Morris or BAT or Japan Tobacco. There's only one big one, really big one, and that's the Chinese state monopoly. 44% of worldwide cigarette production coming out of one company. Well, it's a state monopoly with lots of little bits. And at that stage, they hadn't started down the road at all of reduced risk products. We believe that has now started. There were others where the government has 100% ownership in Vietnam and in Thailand, many in the Middle East, where there was zero movement. And in fact, many of those companies are better known for their illicit trade activities than their efforts to reduce risk. Mm. The report, we think, had a good impact and was received well by the community we were addressing, which was the companies themselves, the major investors, and particularly the large institutions who put their long-term investment in some of these companies. And they want to know, are there places they can put money to still be in the tobacco area, but know that this is moving in a better way than the past? And they draw the analogy to some of the internal combustion motor car companies who are accelerating the electric and the hybrid production. I would say that going forward now, we're hoping to dig down even more deeply into what is it that pushes the R&D agenda faster. What do we know about the intellectual property ownership across these companies? There's a lot of patent filing. It's a bit of a black box at this stage. Over the next months, years, we'll be starting to make it more public, because that becomes very important when you think about how is it going to be possible for the technology, say, in a heated tobacco product or an e-cigarette, to be affordable in a low-middle income country, so that they can use the technology, which often must cost a lot more, at lower cost. That debate is not dissimilar from what we're seeing today on the vaccine debates for COVID-19. A large amount of money goes into patents. The intellectual property is often held by a small group of companies. How can you co-license? How can you share? How can you accelerate the benefit to all, given that this has potentially life-saving potential? And that's where we see this going over the next year or so.
Excellent. You have the focus on industrial transformation, which you sort of broadly defined as delivering change across the entire tobacco industry and the sort of the nicotine ecosystem, and obviously the tobacco transformation, the move away from combustion is obviously a major part of that. Last time we chatted, we talked about some of the science and the technology going into alternative applications of tobacco, and most recently, British American Tobacco, which has a location actually down south here in Kentucky called Kentucky Bioprocessing, announced some very interesting progress in terms of their COVID-19 vaccine, which they have a tobacco company working on COVID, but they're creating a COVID vaccine that they are creating in, of all things, tobacco. It's a very interesting use of this plant. Are you seeing other tobacco companies with interesting technologies in sort of the health pharma space, or other interesting industrial uses of tobacco that don't involve smoking?
Yeah, I think yes, and the answer is yes. And BAT, I think seems to be making good progress, and I think, if I'm right, that they're in phase 2 or phase 3 trials with their vaccine. The same is true in a company called Medicargo, who with Glaxo and PMI are also now in phase 2 and phase 3 with their COVID-19 vaccine. I think it's been very interesting to see the response of the public health community, who sit back and say, oh my God, this is the most terrible thing in the world. They're trying to subvert the world and say that they're great companies because they're now trying to address vaccines. No, the reality is they have been in the tobacco genome work for years, because they have to know everything about the tobacco genome so that they can maximize different characteristics of growing and environmental resilience and nicotine levels and so on. It turns out the tobacco plant is a great factory to produce proteins that can, in this case, be used for vaccines. And they were doing what any sensible person with a bit of a social conscience would do, use the opportunity to address this massive pandemic. I suspect there are going to be other uses of the tobacco plant going down the line, but I don't think that they will actually be able to meet the needs of the massive use now in tobacco. So I still think that countries are going to be vulnerable if they are dependent on tobacco, and Malawi is in the most vulnerable position of lot. With regard to the second part of your question, I do think that the R&D that the larger companies, particularly BAT, PMI, probably to an extent Japan Tobacco now through their pharma interests, and we suspect even some of the e-cigarette companies, Juul, Smoor, and others, are really in the business of trying to develop better inhalation technologies for their products, and better means of getting nicotine absorption. Well, if you stand back and you don't think about nicotine and you ask the question, what other medications do we inhale for our better health? And of course, the whole of the asthma, COPD, cystic fibrosis, increasing pain medication is opening up. And so it'll be very surprising if down the line, some of the patents and some of the developments that are currently being used to develop new means of addressing nicotine and getting cleaner nicotine into people aren't going to have applications in a wide area of biomedicine and medical fields. We don't have proof, we haven't documented it, but that's also a good reason to look into the patent filings, because we're very aware there have been joint filings between a pharma company and a tobacco company, or an e-cigarette company and a pharma company in some aspects of inhalation technology.
The global state of smoking poll you conducted in 2017, you updated it in 2019. I don't know, you looked at tens of thousands of adults across multiple countries. I don't think you've had time to do another one with everything going on, but I was just sort of working off that tobacco and COVID theme. Any interesting insights with this horrible year that we've had with a horrible respiratory virus that you've seen that you could talk about?
Yeah, so we did this survey in 2017, 19, as you said, but last year we did do a smaller set of surveys explicitly in countries under lockdown or various degrees of lockdown to really understand how smokers and those with using these kind of products were coping under different conditions of stress. And I think there have been a couple of things that come out. First of all, from tracking how people perceive the riskiness of, we just use nicotine as an indicator of how people understand, say, e-cigarettes. We've seen trends showing that in almost every country we look at, the perception of nicotine being a cause of cancer has gone in the wrong direction. In other words, more people now believe it causes cancer when it doesn't. And this has come in the year following the EVALI outbreak, which was an outbreak caused by contaminated THC cartridges, virtually unrelated completely to e-cigarettes, but the two were conflated in the social media and by many policymakers in people's minds to think now that e-cigarettes are a cause of all these terrible lung infections, and also conflated with concerns that nicotine is a deadly thing. Put that together, and you've seen in some countries a return from people who've moved from cigarettes to a reduced risk product back to cigarettes. A terrible decision because it's sending them back to the most deadly product of the lot. We found during the pandemic, there were obviously some countries that had complete prohibitions on the sale of cigarettes, some on e-cigarettes initially. Italy, for example, initially banned the sale of e-cigarettes, and colleagues in Italy, Riccardo Peloso, played a single-handed role in actually making the case that this would be a chance to get smokers onto a reduced risk product, and they opened up. In South Africa, though, that didn't happen. And for many months, there was a complete ban on cigarettes, e-cigarettes, and just about anything you'd want to buy. The result, if you know anything about what happens during prohibition, was predictable. It didn't end consumption. It stirred up a massive illicit trade, destroyed the large brands, and created a contraband and a massive criminal element that exists to this day. But the smoker themselves were left with high degrees of anxiety and stress. And that's what we saw across all parts of the world. Everybody suffered stress under lockdown. But somebody who has substance abuse problems and uses nicotine daily and may use some form of substances had even greater stress. And so our concern is that in almost all of the countries, there was the intention offered to shut people down was important to shut the virus down, but there was no support for the social services, the messages, or the outreach to show empathy for people who are already struggling with either their nicotine dependence or their alcohol dependence or some other form of dependence. And to this day, that has not been addressed. And we suspect muddled up in some of the numbers around COVID deaths and disability are a lot that are a result of the impact of all of this anxiety, stress, and depression. And there's some real lessons for us thinking about how we actually address this going forward. I think also what we learned from the surveys was that this is an opportunity as we start easing the pandemic, to raise the value of adult health, given that it's been particularly the 50-plus age group who've suffered the most dire consequences of the pandemic. And I think they're now aware that they should address the other risks. Obesity, of course, we know is a direct risk factor for COVID-19, but it's a time to address risks that may not be related, but certainly have a big impact over your overall health, like smoking. And our hope is that in 2021, as the year unfolds, we'll start seeing people looking at healthier lifestyles returning to the fore for discussion, and not just focusing on the vaccine per se, but the vaccine plus the need now to address better healthy lifestyles. And that's something we'll dig into further during this year.
I noticed that while I have you, of course, this conversation will be about tobacco, but you've been writing quite a bit about COVID vaccination. Obviously, you're a public health specialist. Can we go off topic for a couple minutes and just, can I have Derek Yach talk a little bit about some of what you've been writing about in terms of vaccination and some of your thoughts just on the state of the vaccination dynamic as we sit here entering 2021?
Well, I think there's some real lessons that we learn. You know, it was Wakefield's article in The Lancet in the 90s that first raised the specter that some of the vaccines caused autism, which was turned out to be a fraudulent article. It was withdrawn years later. And it shows that even if you withdraw or retract an article years later, the damage has been done. And there's the belief out there that has spread like wildfire. Taken with the growth of social media, we've now seen what people talk about as the disinformation or the infodemic being paralleled on top of the COVID pandemic. And the two have meant that it's become very difficult for ordinary people with no real background in science to know what is the truth, what is the science. If you start Googling, or if you start going onto Twitter or the social platforms, you'll start seeing all sorts of mythologies, everything from 5G towers leading to COVID, which is not true, or some of the dire consequences of the vaccine, which are not true, or that there's some master plan to have this pandemic for nefarious reasons, which is also not true. But we haven't yet learned how to counter this. And while vaccine hesitancy levels, people who don't want to take the vaccine, we're sort of running at about a third to maybe a little bit more in some countries. I suspect that as we see countries get on top of messaging and showing what they're doing with their vaccine outreach, the numbers will start going down. I think we've started seeing the leadership of the health community getting themselves vaccinated, people from minority communities being vaccinated early and talking about it. The leaders, people who accept as leaders across different strata, saying what's happening, that will all help. So down the line, I actually feel fairly hopeful that while it's a tough thing to start the rollout of a vaccine that we want to have available universally, I think we will get there. Eventually, we got there with polio, and we got there with smallpox all those years before. This one is even more urgent that we get on top of, not in years, but within the next 6, 8, 9 months.
One other, you have the Agricultural and Livelihoods Transformation Initiative. We have tobacco now, 125 countries, represents hundreds of billions of dollars. So now, sorry, that was cigarettes, but billions of dollars of revenue as a crop. We had talked a little bit about Malawi last time, a very poor country, and the impact there, and how some of the difficulties when you go from something high value like tobacco to something like corn. Any interesting success stories? Obviously, it's been a tough year, but on the agricultural transformation front, about new or interesting or alternative crops that are doing a decent job at replacing tobacco.
Yeah, so I think, Malawi has been just such a privilege to work there. There was an election recently. A new cabinet, a new president came in, and the National Planning Commission committed themselves very early on to this transformation journey being a very high priority for government, recognizing the dependence on foreign exchange from tobacco, which was good news, because we've been spending 2 years building a coalition of local agricultural research community, the leading agricultural college and university, bringing in Minnesota State, Michigan State, Stellenbosch, and trying to build the agricultural base on the future of science to say the solution is not going to be one crop. It's going to be a range of livelihoods, some in agriculture, some not. But in agriculture, there'll have to be high yielding crops as well as some essential food crops. We also recognized that it wasn't good enough just to invest in academic institutions and academic research. We needed to be linked to markets, and particularly to young entrepreneurs. So a lot of the programs that are run out of Malawi try and tap into young entrepreneurs, ideally women who are from farms where tobacco is grown. So in November, just a couple of months ago, was the start of the growing season, the planting season. And I'm pleased to say that we're no longer talking. We now have vegetables growing in a range of greenhouses. We have bamboo growing as an alternative fuel and many other characteristics. We have dairy production starting to expand, all coming out of areas or farmers who were previously engaged full-time in tobacco farming. And we will obviously be looking down the line to see which of these and which combinations will give them the long-term sustainable wealth and livelihood to keep going. And it's not going to be one, it's going to be some combination over time. And also requires us to be thinking not just about the crop, but the crop and the market and the price and the access and the desirability to consume it and use it and add value to it. I think that's a huge set of insights that within a year, I think we'll have some good results already out of Malawi. I think more broadly, I think the analytic work that we're doing on tobacco, keeps asking this question, not just are there alternative uses of tobacco, but where does the nicotine that we use in the patch or the gum or in e-cigarettes come from? And how can the tobacco farming communities actually gain the extra revenue that comes from not just exporting your leaf, but exporting a higher value product like nicotine? Mm-hmm. And it turns out that the vast majority of the nicotine comes from India. And they were previously exporting it in a very crude form, so not getting the added value. And now we're starting to see within the country what's called beneficiation, investing in more higher quality extraction so that the value that they're going to get on the profits will be retained in India and not be made by somebody sitting in a laboratory somewhere else. And we suspect that'll be useful in the case of India. In the case of other countries, it's not that clear. And I think different countries will have to take different paths.
You just stimulated one other thing. Obviously, nicotine, very useful in the nicotine patches. We talked a little bit about the tobacco as a bioreactor. Obviously, there is a tremendous pharmacology behind the nicotinic system in our bodies. Have you been watching what's been going on in terms of nicotinic receptor agonist, antagonist type drugs for whether they're, tobacco cessation or other therapeutic uses?
Yes, and we hope that the listeners will start watching a new website we launched over the last few months called understandingnicotine.org, which is explicitly dedicated to this. And what we're doing on that website is we're sucking in three streams of digital information and trying to make it available to the public and to scientists. The first is, how does the public perceive nicotine generally? What do they think about it when it's in the form of a cigarette, which is usually going to be deadly because of the cigarette, in an e-cigarette or a patch where it can be pretty inert? And the discussion around that, that's one set of information. The second is, what are the scientists publishing? Who's publishing stuff on the use of nicotine, the advanced understanding about nicotine receptor links, as well as obviously to viruses, which is particularly topical now. And what we're finding is that particularly the area of neuroscience is taking off. The interest in nicotine on the brain, nicotine perhaps playing some role in Parkinson's from a preventive point of view, perhaps being linked to some aspects of memory, particularly with the aging brain. We suspect this field is starting to take off, and the insights and knowledge we will be curating and putting out as fast as we can And then the third part of the website is saying, well, yes, there's a whole lot of science going on, but the real proof is who's putting their money where their mouth is, who's investing in stuff coming out of it. And so the patents that are coming out of these new insights, we will also be putting out in the public domain so people can see what are the applications that companies are seeking, which eventually find their way to the market in 4, 5, 6 years from now. We suspect that we will actually get a higher quality discourse around nicotine by letting people understand the underlying science and the direction of the research is taking. Whereas at the moment, I think many people, understandably, if you say the word nicotine, what do they think of? They see a cigarette and they see lung cancer. And it's not that easy to actually separate that in people's minds. We hope that over time it will, and then you'll be able to see there are two very different problems. End combustion, in the use of all the combustibles, that is one task that we should really set ourselves, but that does not require, and probably should not require, taking all the nicotine out. It may be nicotine is the vehicle needed for so many people to get out of the combustible.
As we've been locked down the last year, and hopefully, coming out of this, horrific pandemic. Well, first part of the question is: has the lockdown quarantine kept you out of the water? And if it has not, have you been doing any interesting swims since last time we talked?
Well, this is where the readers probably think I've gone completely loony during lockdown. So I have a group of very good friends, and we decided in early May, when all the gyms were closed, the YMCA, which is my favorite place I go to, had closed. And the water temperature just hit 50 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know what your listeners listening, but it hit 50. And we decided, to hell with the cold, we're in. And we don't do wetsuits. So we started swimming most days at dawn, just before the sun rose, and kept going through the spring, the summer, and the autumn started coming along, and we were enjoying it so much. We thought, well, we'll keep going until we get back to 50, because it went up to 75 and then back down to 50. And when we passed 50 and we went to the high 40s, we thought, well, maybe this cold thing is not to be taken too seriously. The long or the short of it, here we are in January, we're swimming at 38. Don't ask me how we're doing it. We've kind of adapted. We obviously have dropped our distance to just under a mile, half a mile to a mile at that temperature. And we spend a reasonable amount of time shivering. But the pleasure, the camaraderie, the beauty of the open water, I think, can only help.
Excellent. Yeah, and if it reduces the social isolation, hey, a little cold,
we're socially distanced on the water, I can assure you.
Oh, Jack, I appreciate you taking the time to update us all on everything that's going on. As always, a fascinating set of objectives you have there, and wishing you the best in moving it forward, because this is such a major health problem, a major killer. And once again, thank you for what you're doing. For everybody listening on the podcast or watching on this particular YouTube channel, you've been listening to Dr. Derek Yach, founder, president, board member of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, doing everything they can do to reduce deaths and diseases caused by smoking, as well as having a very important goal of ultimately ending smoking in this generation. Derek, thank you again for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to us and update us. Thank you to keep doing what you're doing. As we say, thank you for helping to create a better tomorrow, because once this smoking is out of the way, it's truly going to be a very beneficial time for many people across the world. And really thank you.
And thank you too, Ira. Much appreciated.